Here we have a half-timbered frame house, a historic house, and I'm sure when it had just been renovated, it was a pleasure to look at. It has unusual colors, unusual texture on the wall, and I'm sure the people who renovated it were very proud of their work, leaving this sign that reads, "Half-timbered houses are cheery. Keep and preserve them." We see from this sign that the building was renovated 20 years ago. And on this side of the house, which is the side that's most exposed to weather, there's a lot of wood rot. When a 100-year-old house looks like this, just 20 years after being restored, something must have been done incorrectly. Here we see three major errors. In the cracks, we have a watertight, perhaps silicone putty. We also have a layer of cement plaster next to the wood, which tends to trap water. And we also have a synthetic paint on the wood beams. There may be other less obvious damage to the wood, but it's harder to evaluate under latex paint. Here we have another house, one which I had good things to say about a few years ago due to its historic windows. It's been given this plaque for outstanding renovation, which is at least in part due to the repair of the beams, which involved fitting wedges and slats into the wood. But in the meantime, there must have been a change in ownership, as recent renovation has been something of a disaster. Gaps have been filled with polyurethane foam, which you can see oozing out of the joints. Here's the difference between a photo taken today and one taken 3 years ago. And this foam essentially traps water next to the wood and causes it to rot. In addition, we can see that the paint hasn't held up well. A traditional oil-based paint would have been a better choice, but here we see the paint starting to flake and peel away. Here's the ceiling in a historic house where an old and a new type of paint can be seen side by side. The most recent coat is latex, and it doesn't rub off on your finger as powder. It tends to come off in large flakes. The lime paint underneath, however, will rub off slightly. We can confirm that the top coat is synthetic by pulling off a few flakes and putting it in hydrochloric acid. Here we have a 30% solution of hydrochloric acid. You could also do this with vinegar, but it would take a lot longer. Here I'm putting the paint flakes in. We can also do this test with some plaster to see the difference between cement plaster and lime plaster. On the left is a piece of cement plaster, and on the right is a piece of lime plaster. After a few minutes, we can see that the latex paint has not dissolved. A synthetic skin remains. The lime plaster has completely dissolved and only sand remains. However, the cement plaster is completely intact and would take much longer than a few minutes to be affected by the acid. The important thing to remember when renovating a historic building is to avoid materials that are impermeable and thus tend to trap water, leading to decay. This was the case in the first house we saw, which, just 20 years after renovation, showed significant rot. Of course, the use of modern materials will not necessarily lead to problems, but we should be aware of older methods that have proved themselves over decades, even centuries, and use them where appropriate. Today, many people are still putting cement plaster, silicone filler, and synthetic paint on historic buildings. But with awareness of the disadvantages of these materials and knowledge of historic techniques, we can make better choices.